Kevin Martin here, your UT admissions guide. In this workshop, I've recreated and reproduced with permission a real UT Austin student application, and I want to walk you through what an admissions reviewer might be thinking as they're reading and trying to assess which admissions score to assign this applicant. We'll look at the essays and the resume and discuss the results at the end. I hope you enjoy this video.
Hello and welcome to this SAA application workshop, where I walk you through the steps of how a SAA of a real student goes from their first draft all the way to their final version. And so this particular essay went through about 5 different iterations before we arrived at the copy that they eventually submitted on Apply Texas. And this is a student that eventually gained admission to the Macomb School of Business. And I like to do these kinds of process-oriented essay workshops because so often students just genuinely have no idea how essays, especially the ones they see on blog posts like mine, on books like 50 Essays That Got a Given Student into Harvard, or any other highly polished drafts that you see online, or maybe that your friend had shown you who's an older college student, for example. And it's important to see that essays are not created by raw talent alone, but it's incredibly important to take the editing, rewriting process seriously, because there's always ways to make tweaks and improve upon the first drafts. And so often students, they sometimes ask, or they have a hard time understanding how good or not good their essay quality is relative to the average applicant, because again, they only see a small sample of essays that are published online or that students might share. So they might only see, a handful of different college essays, if any. So there's no standard with which to compare their essay to others. So I often see students trying to self-evaluate or self-diagnose their essays on a scale of 1 to 10 whenever they're reporting their admissions results on College Confidential or Reddit. And they'll say things like, my essays were a 7.5 out of 10, but it's totally meaningless because there's no data or sample size with which to compare it to. And a common theme when I was reviewing applications for UT Austin, it seems to be the case for admissions reviewers all over the United States, that even highly talented students are often not submitting very good essays. And so another related question is, what does a typical essay for that students submit to colleges look like? And I think the SAA first draft here, before the student and I have worked together at all, is a fairly typical example of what an SAA looks like. And so often students are submitting their first efforts, they're submitting last-minute applications, and this is probably an above-average essay. It's a solid essay from the beginning. They begin with some nice details, opening up with an anecdote to overview a series of injuries that they ended up having later on. They also share a little bit of background about their family. And this particular student had injuries beyond simply in sports, but they seem to have had a wide variety of different ailments and procedures going all the way back to their kindergarten years. And so they provided a good foundation here with a number of different anecdotes, specific examples and experiences from their life. They've also done a nice job of describing some of the conditions they have. And so all in all, it's a really thoughtful first effort. And, they're tracing kind of in a linear way how their health has proceeded from their early years all the way through to the present day. They've also done a nice job of trying to incorporate a quote here at the end. But what we're going to see later on is that much of this essay is going to look very different as we proceed through the different versions. Things that might start at the second paragraph, we might move down later on. We're also going to work on, in later versions, more specific instances or addressing stylistic concerns or grammar or ways to structure and communicate the same ideas in less words. So we'll navigate a few different themes here, and I hope that this workshop can show you how to take your first essay, which might look something like this, and how you as an applicant can elevate your own essays by simply starting to ask some questions. So when I get an essay for the first time, instead of telling a student change this or don't do that, or this sentence needs to be moved here or something like that, or even I don't do any editing. That's why I call it structural editing and big picture questions, where I simply pose or challenge to the student a variety of different propositions and scenarios. A lot of these questions just come down to tell me more, or what do you mean by this, or what happened after. So the first suggestion I give here, and I think it's sound advice for all applicants, if you want, especially for an SAA that prompts you to tell us your story, is I note that it's a great job that he's began immediately with the story, but it feels a little bit underdeveloped. And so I ask a few contextual questions like, how old were you? What was the context? Who was playing against who? What was the outcome? And all of these questions are just suggestions. And as you're going through after you write your first draft, you can imagine, what might a hypothetical admissions reviewer or another person might want to know about a given topic. And so that's the role that I'm playing here as the reviewer, to try and prompt some of these questions. But it's something that you can do as well. Just imagine that someone else has written this essay, for example, or you're preparing it for publication and you want to be as detail-oriented as possible while still being economical with your words. So there's another theme that occurs throughout, especially in this student's essay, is passive versus active voice. So passive voice is when the action itself is emphasized. So for example, this is active voice. A specialist diagnosed me. Passive voice would be, I was diagnosed with osteochondritis dissecans. And so that's something that's a common theme. I'll sort of point out some different areas. I think I already started to clean up some of these, but since you're writing from the first person point of view, you should almost always be using the active voice, because you want to emphasize the person doing the action rather than the action itself. It also makes who is doing the acting more clear and defined. And so one way to avoid vagueness is to convert your voice from active to passive. And so it looks like in this version I've already converted some for the student itself. In other cases, I leave it up to the student. I'll sort of note different places where they have used passive voice and then make recommendations for how to convert that into active. And the general rule of thumb is, if to convert something from passive to active voice, you simply switch the agent of action or the emphasis of what you're talking about. So we'll talk about that a little more whenever we go into line editing. And so again, there's some more different kind of clarifying questions and what's happening next. Because again, so often students are writing vaguely and we just don't really know what it is that's going on. This is kind of a nice paragraph in its own right. We know exactly, there's a nice transition here. We know exactly what was happening in their early years. And again, it's segueing into another, somewhat severe situation during their junior year of having a cyst removed from their jaw. And so we'll see what the implementation of some of these look like in later drafts, but recall in the earlier draft that they talked about their parents in the second paragraph. And then here I've gone ahead and moved the discussion of the parents further down so that way they can talk more about the narrative of their basketball injuries, and then a segue later on to providing more background into the environment in which they were raised. And I've also noticed a few different areas here. For example, anytime you're using a quote, it can be important to talk about where that quote comes from. It's not like you just Googled like good quotes about suffering or rehabilitation, but instead, if you're going to use a quote, it can often help provide the context of where you found it. Was it a book, a podcast you listened to? Is there, did someone introduce you? Did you actually know the author? It's okay to make a quote, but if you're going to use a quote, I would say do it sparingly, say no more than 2 in a given essay, and, try and provide some of that background context. And so here's some of the initial thoughts I have, and you can already see the essay is taking a bit of a different shape by moving some of the different paragraphs around. So another question you can ask yourself is, with every paragraph in your essay, ask yourself, should I move this sooner? Should it come later? Or what might my essay look like if I move it later or keep it higher up in the essay order? Because there's no real right or wrong way with which to structure your essay. And I think some students can get tripped up because you're so used to writing these introduction, 3-body paragraph conclusions in your English class, for example. Whereas these essays, the structure itself can be much more fluid and flexible. And oftentimes that structure is going to change as the essay continues. So in this version here, I've done a variety of more structural, but also started the line editing process. And I'll also use this configuration to show you some of the things that have changed. Most notably, for example, that the paragraph about the parents that ended up getting moved further down. I resolved a lot of the comments because here they begin to describe more about what was happening during some of these various procedures and ailments that they are experiencing. And so they've done a nice job already of providing specific information about how they've adapted and found some sort of resilience. I left the comment to continue expanding upon the introduction. Again, especially whenever I'm laying a lot of different questions and comments and inquiries here, it can be hard to address everything at once. But again, that's the importance of taking the essay editing process seriously, because you may not get everything right the first time, or you may not address every relevant thing that might be a room for improvement, for example. We'll do the markup here and kind of work through it a little bit so we can see. Let's start from the top. So we removed that paragraph about the parents, and then here we're starting to convert some of that active voice into passive. So instead of saying I was a starter, you just say I started for my middle school team, leading each in 3 points and scoring. So instead of saying leading each in 3 points, shooting, and in scoring, we've already said in a preposition here. So that preposition will qualify both objects, so 3 point scoring, 3 point shooting, and scoring. Another example of passive voice: began to have severe knee pain. You can just say I started experiencing. It's more forceful. We know exactly what's going on. You're using 3 words instead of 2. So I was diagnosed, a specialist diagnosed me. So we have the agent of action, the action itself, and then the object, or the personal, the object pronoun is in this case the first person singular. And then it's always a good idea, if you're going to use medical jargon or technical jargon, to do a brief description of what that means. So we know that osteochondritis dissecans is a disease that restricts blood flow between joints and causes dead spots on my bones. And so they had a description earlier, but it was quite long and convoluted. It was in the past. Passive voice is caused by. So instead it's a disease is the agent, restricts is the action, and blood flow is the object of the action that's receiving. Okay. So here we've converted active into passive, passive into active again. It had read the bones of my knees were inflamed, and now it's I lived with debilitating knee inflammation. Another example of converting passive into active is you can, instead of using be verbs and being dependent on was, were, am, is, you can say I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. It also saves more words. I was unable to even walk up a flight of stairs. So you're communicating the point more directly, more forcefully. And making all of these little adjustments throughout the course of an essay is going to improve fluency. It's going to encourage you to use different types of vocabulary, substituting be verbs for more active action verbs. Again here, instead of saying with the risk of re-injury and potential injury, we just say fearing re-injury or surgery. And another rule of thumb that I look for is anytime you encounter an action word like this, made the decision, you can simply say decided. So we've saved 3 words. And again, decreased on any ambiguity. Sometimes it's okay to use the passive voice. You don't always have to say a specialist, a physician, my pediatrician diagnosed me with slight scoliosis. So there are times to use the passive voice. You don't always have to use active, but if 90% of the time you're using passive voice when the active would be more appropriate, it's going to grate on your reviewer eventually. And then here we're clarifying who was doing the diagnosing. It was the spine specialist. So we have more context and details, which was an improvement from the previous draft, where they're supplying exactly how living with scoliosis and a brace is in fact impacting their daily lives and movements. And again here, we're just trying to be more economical. Another good idea is to illustrate and to develop empathy in a relationship with your reviewer is to illustrate through an analogy or a metaphor what it is you're feeling, seeing, touching, thinking. This was something that I suggested we add in. that breathing and eating was imaginally uncomfortable, but imaginally uncomfortable doesn't actually paint an image in the reviewer's head, or it doesn't give them any basis with which to make a comparison in their own life. But we can sort of imagine, like we've all received as a kid, or maybe from like your like overly zealous grandmother or grandpa, that they give you a giant bear hug that never lets go, and we can kind of have that visual. So again, we're developing more and providing more illustrations and visual language to make the essay a little bit more alive, and also develop empathy with the student. So here we're just being a little more economical, communicating in the most information possible in the least amount of words. Just like here, however, the scars on my rib area from the rubbing of the brace are still visible today. See, we've converted that "are still visible." You can say, I still have visible scars around my ribs. So by converting passive into active, and also substituting those be verbs with more active verbs, we have much more nice and compact sentences. Here we've added the transition. I was no stranger to infections or ailments. Another example here is trying to avoid the gerund or progressive. So is compressing, was progressing, I will be eating, I was eating. You can simply say a sinus infection compressed my brainstem. It's a little more economical, and it's also more direct by using the simple past rather than the progressive version of the past tense. And again here, I had surgery to remove. You can simply say a surgeon removed. We're saving 2 words. And again, these 2 words, 3 words, 5 words, 6 words, it really adds up over time. Students will send me first drafts sometimes that are over 1,000 words, and they think, oh, I can never, get this down. And that's not even with just removing paragraphs and sentences wholesale, but just these little things here and there, you're just saving. It's like putting $1 or $5 in the bank every day for a month. It doesn't sound like much, but going without a coffee each day, you're going to save $3 or $4. Depending on what you get. And essay writing is a similar process. Instead, showed it was, again, returned. Much more concise and direct. Have to be monitored as passive voice, require monitoring, active. My parents give me courage to struggle through the pain, right? So we've taken a 30-word sentence and condensed it down to 10. So each time you're looking at a sentence, think to yourself, which words are absolutely necessary? Are there places I can condense? Are there areas where I can substitute one word for another? Is it possible to speak more directly by making the agent of action more clear and direct? And then here we're developing a little bit more of a relationship and nuance and complexity by talking about an injury that his own mother experienced, and how he was kind of the one that was kind of there for support, because he'd had a pretty tough life, and sort of knew what some of these rehabilitation and living with pain is like. And so again, we've condensed that paragraph by about 1/3. And also, each time you come across given sentences, you can ask yourself, is this sentence absolutely necessary? Would the sentence be more appropriate earlier or later in a given draft? And sometimes you might just need to remove it entirely. And so here, and then we have simply a nice conclusion about how they continued being a volunteer for a local wheelchair basketball league as a referee, which is pretty cool. So just the content itself is obviously very thoughtful and nuanced, and it tells a very nice story. And then we've also condensed it quite a lot from where we started. So let's hop over to what's getting to be closer to the end. So remember that I had recommended that they expand upon the introduction a little bit more. And so here we have a lot more nice details and sentences about what was going on, who was playing who. It was their team, the Sun Devils, against their biggest competitor. I've also noted some areas, if you recall from the very first draft up here, we had one sort of long sentence. I went down hard, tumbling across the hardwood floor, the basketball flying out of my hands, skinning both of my knees and one elbow in the process. It's a bit of a run-on sentence to begin with, but here we've broken up compound sentences into simple ones. So that one sentence that we weren't exactly sure what was going on, the agent of action was unclear, the recipient of the actions were also unclear. We have a nice, direct, I went down hard, tumbling across the court. I skinned my knees and elbow as the basketball flew out of my hands towards the other fifth graders. So we know what the time is. We know who's playing who. We understand the stakes. Facing them in the first round of the playoffs is tough enough. Tripping over another player and face planting in front of everyone made our day even more difficult. So it's kind of like slightly entertaining as well. You can imagine like a group of elementary school kids kind of clumsily playing basketball. Yeah, and it's just quite a nice opening anecdote. And so here we've developed the context a little bit more. I even added in, what I could imagine is happening. I heard shouting from the bleachers and looked up, rather than simply saying, like a quote, "Get up, you're okay, keep going." I could hear my parents shouting from the bleachers. And again, we're converting the active or the passive into active. I heard shouting from the bleachers. And so that sets it up nicely. And so there's still some of the same corrections that I had made before, except here I've noted exactly what we've changed. So here's one change in this essay. A specialist diagnosed me with the disease osteochondritis dissecans. Before, there had been a comma that described what that condition was, but instead we split that up into two sentences so that way we don't, kind of give or overload the reader with too much information, because the period indicates to take a pause, and your reviewer is going to take that invitation. And we know that it comes from repeated knee trauma from playing basketball, created blood flow loss in the joints, and caused dead spots on my bones. So we know exactly what this condition is and how it relates to the student themselves. There was also some chronology issues, so it can sometimes be a little confusing if you're jumping around. So you don't want to say, when I was 7, I was diagnosed with slight scoliosis, and then jump back to age 5, and then come down to something in junior year. So it can be a good idea if you're going to discuss kind of a linear list of conditions or something that's time dependent. It's good to put it in kind of this happened at A time, this other thing happened at B time, and then afterwards at C time, X thing occurred. So it's good to kind of get the chronology straight. Even if you're starting, sometimes introductions can start, and it's okay to circle back to something back in time, but if you're moving time signatures too often, you might often lose your reviewer. So another question you can ask yourself whenever you're writing your essays is, does the reviewer know where they're at? If I handed this essay to a stranger, would they understand, more or less what happened to me and which order it happened? And so one of the first paragraphs that we had started with was the My Parents Give Me Courage. So a lot of the content is the same. You might notice that the content isn't all that different from where we started. But it's just tweaking, it's developing, it's adding. Even here, this is the 4th version, and there's always places to be more specific. Instead of saying, we collected food for the local food bank, why don't you tell your reviewer directly how much food that you collected, right? So in the final version, we'll see that they added in that they collected $4,200 in donations for the local food bank. So again, all of these little details will add up over time and make your essay more direct, more powerful, easier to follow, more interesting, and perhaps even entertaining for your reviewer, depending on the content and the message that you're trying to communicate. And so this version here, the 4th version, is, the structure's in place. We've addressed a lot of these big questions. There's still some minor details to hash out. But we'll just jump straight to what the final version eventually looked like. And I'll turn on the all markup so we can see that it looks more or less the same. So from the 4th version, we've pretty much got there. So just small things like changing, in this instance, it made sense to use a semicolon rather than a comma, because each phrase is rather balanced, because we have the love of playing basketball directly relates to their long-term ambition of joining their high school basketball team. Small things too. If you are already using a verb like make, you can say, I worked hard to join. So again, if you're using and relying upon, and this just happens, even my own writing will tend to rely on some of the same verbs over and over. But if you can use synonyms, again, it just introduces a little bit more complexity, a little bit more nuance, without doing anything complicated. It's not like join or make or any more or less sophisticated words, but it's just mixing things up a little bit more without trying too hard. I think another mistake students will make is they'll use big or obscure words because they think it makes their writing more mature, but often large or obscure words for their own sake can lead to more confusion and less clarity. And so all throughout this editing process, the idea is to be as concise, direct, and precise as possible while writing economically, because we again have a limited number of words. So here we're changing things up a little bit. Instead of this comma, we'll use this gerund form, comma, leading each in 3-point shooting and scoring. And here's just a few small things, minor corrections. So here's another example. So what's going on here is I am no stranger. It had said I have been, and have been is in the present perfect. So it's relevant to look at each time you're using a verb tense. Of course that the verb tenses agree with each other, but either version is correct. I'm and I've been, it both suggest the same thing. It's something that happened in the past and is continuing into the present. But again, if we're looking at word economy, we can shave off 2 words. So I'm no stranger to pain or life-changing circumstances. It's the same meaning. But again, anytime you can use the simple past or simple present rather than these more complex or often obscure or kind of vagary-inducing present or like these perfect tenses, it can be effective to avoid those progressive and to simply use the simple past, present, future. So here again, we're just, so instead of this, we're just kind of cleaning things up a little bit more. We already know that the object of the sentence is our family, so you can substitute it with the pronoun us. And so this is what I hope to be an interesting example of going from the various stages of the essay writing process. Sometimes I like to run Grammarly here. We'll see if they suggest any corrections, but overall you can see that this is a very thoughtful essay that eventually sets up a lot of their short answers. Some small things here like adding in hyphens. Grammarly is also good because it can tell you to at least consider writing sentences in different ways. And so that's another way that I'll use Grammarly sometimes, is to see just different ways to break up a different sentence. And this sentence is definitely quite a mouthful. I received a tonsillectomy, adenoidectomy, ethmoidemectomy, and yet another life surgery when a life-threatening mastoid sinus infection compressed my brainstem. So you could say by age 5 I received these treatments. And something like another surgery, or I experienced another surgery when a life-threatening. So that's one way to break up a sentence like that. Here, so they're suggesting to break apart 2 different adjectives whenever both of them could be in either order. But these are all just small things, and again, Grammarly isn't a software that you're going to use in the first draft or the second draft, but it's nice because you can pick up some of these really small things to just polish and put the finishing touches on a given essay. And so again, we started from the SAA where much of the content is still the same. Like there weren't so many big content changes, but it was just this process of asking questions, being more specific, supplying some of these details, expanding upon anecdotes, converting passive voice into active, and also substituting be verbs for more active verbs. And so I know this is a lot to take in, but I just wanted to show you kind of what goes through my mind through each stage of the editing process, and what I'm looking for ways to improve a student's essay. So I hope that you enjoyed this content, and feel free to email me with any questions or concerns that you might have.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find more helpful information at texadmissions.com/blog. And in the information section of this video, I provide links to a free online email consultation if you're interested in potentially working together, and links to my book, Your Ticket to the 40 Acres, and my premium course, Getting into Texas Universities. Thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.